Okay, good afternoon. I think we can proceed. Everyone is here, and because the recording has begun, I'll take that as the message to get started. The bailiff can interrupt me if he disagrees or thinks that we should wait, but if we don't hear from him, we'll call the case of United States versus Carabasset. My name is Judge Harper. Jurors, if you could please look at the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and please make sure to turn off your audio and video. These should remain off until the trial ends. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. This means the only people on the screen right now should be the two advocates and me. And I'll ask right now the attorney for the government to please make your appearance.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Cole Reese. Today I'm joined by my co-counsel, Mr. Jared Nigra.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Together we represent the people of the United States of America.
Thank you both. Defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name's Ethan Marx, joined today by my second chair, Mr. Michael Ragnoni. You won't be able to see or hear him today as he'll be handling the technology as we represent the defendant, Carabasset.
Very good. Good afternoon to you both as well. Before we move to the opening statements, are there any preliminary matters from either party?
Just two preliminary matters from the government, Your Honor.
Sure.
First, we would just like to invoke Rule 615, constructively sequestering all witnesses for today's trial.
That's granted.
Yes, Your Honor. And also, we just wanted to make sure that the court was aware of Stipulation 7, which states that Exhibits 4 through 33 have been pre-admitted and may be used at any point for any purpose.
Yes, the court is aware of the stipulation. Just please remind the court of the stipulation if you're offering into evidence a document that has already been pre-admitted.
Yes, Your Honor. With that, the government is ready for opening statements.
Thank you. Mr. Marx?
Yes, just one, Your Honor. We also wanted to make the court aware of the stipulation that goes right in hand with number 7, pretrial order number 6. It just states that any documents that have been put in evidence can be displayed on the screen during opens, close, and examinations without having to get prior permission.
Yes, that's fine. No need to get permission to display documents. And the same is true for the defense. To the extent that you're seeking to refer to a document that's been pre-admitted, just remind the court of that stipulation.
Of course.
Thank you both very much. We'll now hear opening statements from each party. Everyone, please make sure that you are in speaker view. That button is in the upper right of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking. And when you're prepared, the attorney for the government may present your opening statement.
Yes, Your Honor. Follow the defendant's words. Members of the jury, this is Don Clark. On August 18th of 2017, Mr. Clark disappeared from his Tallahassee home without a trace. This disappearance wasn't an accident. In fact, members of the jury, it wasn't a disappearance at all. It was murder. And today we'll prove the person responsible for his murder was the defendant, his own wife, Cara Bassett. That's why today, as the government, we've charged the defendant with murder, which means that it's our burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant deliberately and intentionally caused the death of her husband. That is exactly what we're going to prove, and we'll prove it by following the defendant's words. From before, to during, to after she killed her husband. So let's start with before. Today, you're going to hear from an FBI agent named Steph Brand. She's going to connect the defendant's words with other evidence she collected and tell you how it all leads back to the defendant having committed this crime. Agent Brandon will start with why the defendant would want to kill her husband. It may seem strange, But today you're going to hear Mr. Clark owned an elephant park the defendant wanted control of. You see, she thought the elephants were being treated poorly under Mr. Clark's ownership. So the defendant made a plan. Today, Agent Brandon will tell you about a legal agreement between the defendant and Mr. Clark that would give Miss Bassett control of that park if her husband could no longer run. And you'll hear how the defendant specifically asked for a section to be added to that agreement. A section that would give Miss Bassett control of that park if her husband mysteriously disappeared. And then he did. So we'll follow the defendant's words to the time during her husband's disappearance. Today, Agent Branham is going to tell you that despite the defendant not knowing where her husband was, she didn't call him. She didn't text him. Members of the jury, she didn't even tell the police until an entire week after her husband went missing. She didn't say a word. She didn't say a word because she knew exactly what had happened to her husband. Today, Agent Branham will show you physical evidence that will prove the defendant injected her husband with elephant tranquilizer, then dumped his body in a swamp. And that brings us to the defendant's words after she killed her husband. Today, you're going to see videos and hear about interviews of the defendant from after her husband's death. Her words from that time will show you she wasn't upset about what had happened to her husband. She wasn't upset because she was responsible. Members of the jury, when you follow the defendant's words from before to during to after, they will lead you straight to Dawn Clark's death. That's why I'll ask that you find her guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. Counsel for the defendant.
Yes, Your Honor. We just want to clarify that we will be displaying 2 documents in our open. They're part of those pre-admitted documents under pretrial order 7.
Thank you very much.
Judge Harper, Mr. Reese, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Lisa Clark. When Mr. Reese spoke to you just a moment ago, that's a name he didn't mention once. That's because the government, they don't want you to know who Lisa Clark is. Today you're going to hear about an investigation. An investigation where of the dozens of suspects, the FBI locked onto one, Kara Bassett. But when you lock onto a target, analyze it through a microscope sometimes, you can fail to see what's right in front of you. Today you're going to learn that there was another suspect. A suspect that you'll had threatened to kill Dawn Clark in the past. A suspect that Dawn Clark had called the police on. And a suspect that you'll learn was never even investigated by the FBI. That suspect is Lisa Clark, Dawn Clark's ex-wife. They've got the wrong spouse, and they're telling the wrong story. Today, we're going to tell you about the right spouse. Mr. Reese told you a few moments ago to follow the defendant's words. We're going to ask you to follow Lisa Clark's words. You're going to hear that in the months leading up to Dawn's disappearance, Lisa was seen at their property, threatening him, shouting that she would wipe him off the face of the earth. Not only that, you'll learn that Lisa was suing Dawn for $2 million and that for 2 years she hadn't gotten a penny. So you'll learn on August 18th, 2017, when she sent this text message, when she showed you these words, telling Dawn that she was tired of dealing with the attorneys. and he cast her aside, that's when Lisa Clark took matters into her own hands. She did exactly what her words told us she would do. She wiped him off the face of the earth. They've got the wrong spouse, and they're telling the wrong story. That's because in the FBI's entire investigation, they never even considered Lisa Clark to be a suspect. Instead, they locked onto Kara Bassett. But when Miss Bassett came to court today, she was presumed to be innocent. And she still is, unless the government can meet every single element of their claim beyond a reasonable doubt. They can't just tell you that it could have been Miss Bassett. They have to prove to you that it could only have been Miss Bassett, that it could not have been Lisa Clark. But they won't be able to do that because they've got the wrong spouse and they're telling the wrong story. Now today, we don't have a burden. We don't have to ask a single question, present a single piece of evidence, call a single witness, but we're going to. Today, you'll hear from Joe Young, a television producer that worked with Don and Kara for 2 years. Miss Young will tell you that from what she saw, Don and Kara were in love, and the only one she heard saying she was angry at Don was Lisa Clark. They've got the wrong spouse, and they're telling the wrong story. Follow Lisa Clark's words, and when you do, we'll ask that you find Miss Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marx. Before the government calls its first witness, I'll ask everyone to please switch to gallery view. That button is in the upper right of your screen. This will allow you to see the attorneys and the witness at the same time. And does the government have a witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the government calls Agent Steph Branham to the stand.
Okay, Agent Branham.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
Good afternoon. Would you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Good afternoon. I'm Senior Special Agent Steph Branham with the FBI Tallahassee Field Office.
Agent Branham, did you ever investigate a case at the FBI involving the disappearance of a man named Don Clark?
I did. I was the lead investigator on that particular case.
What evidence did you review for that investigation?
I reviewed physical evidence, documents of Lisa Clark, Kara Bassett and Don Clark's relationship, as well as forensic evidence which my team collected. And I really focused my investigation on what Miss Bassett said before her husband disappeared, during the week of her husband's disappearance, before the FBI was contacted, and since then.
Agent, I want to focus on what the defendant said before her husband went missing. Are you familiar with Mr. Clark's power of attorney document?
I am. This was a document which granted Miss Bassett the ability to seize Mr. Clark's assets in given circumstances, specified circumstances.
Your Honor, at this time, we're going to put that on the screen. It's already in evidence pursuant to stipulation 7.
Okay, thank you.
So, Agent Branham, did any part of this document stand out to you in your investigation?
Yes, sir. There's a specific clause in this document that stated should Don Clark disappear, Miss Bassett would be able to gain access to his assets.
Ma'am, I want to talk about this disappearance clause. We've heard a little bit about Lisa Clark already today. Did Lisa Clark have a disappearance clause with Mr. Clark?
No, sir. Miss Bassett specifically requested that this clause be put into this power of attorney agreement.
Now let's transition into the night that Mr. Clark went missing. When was that?
August 18th of 2017.
Did you find any evidence to explain what might have happened on that night?
Yes, sir. We used forensic evidence, as I said, and GPS evidence to retrack Don Clark's movements on the night of his disappearance.
Ma'am, did you ever conduct a review of the elephant park Mr. Clark looked at?
Yes, sir. We reviewed forensic evidence at this park, including syringes of carfentanil and elephant tranquilizer.
Let's talk about those syringes a little more. Did you ever find a log of how those syringes were kept?
We did. This log is marked Exhibit 19, I believe. It tracked the use of those syringes. They're a highly toxic substance, so individuals had to check those syringes out if they wished to use one.
Mr. Niagara, let's get that document on the screen, and Your Honor, it's already in evidence pursuant to Stipulation 7.
Thank you.
So, Agent Branham, I want to focus on the last entry here. Did you find anything about that last entry specifically interesting throughout your investigation?
Yes, sir. As you can see, that last entry claims that 24 syringes of carfentanil should have been remaining. My investigation revealed that only 23 syringes remained. I also learned that Miss Bassett could easily access these syringes from her home, that she regularly did so, that she knew how to use these syringes and of their toxicity.
Agent Branham, do you know if Lisa Clark could regularly access these syringes?
No, she could not. One would need a key to access them.
Now, you also mentioned that you reviewed GPS data. Mr. Niagara, let's get that on the screen. And again, Your Honor, this is already in evidence. So, Agent Branham, where did this GPS data come from? What vehicle?
This is the data from Mr. Clark's Chevrolet van. The data was generated with any movements made by that van, whether or not a GPS navigation system was used.
And what exactly did this GPS data show you in your investigation?
Well, as you can see, on the night of Don Clark's disappearance, the van was driven from Mr. Clark's home at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, almost 2 hours to the Big Gum Swamp, also in Florida. It remained at that swamp for almost an hour before being driven back to the Carrie Bell Leon Airport, about 5 miles from Miss Bassett's home. It was abandoned at that airport, remained there until my team recovered it a week later.
Agent Branham, as far as you're aware, did Lisa Clark have a key to that van?
No, she did not.
You also mentioned additional forensic testing. What was that forensic testing?
We collected algae and mud samples from the Big Gum Swamp that the van visited that night, and we cross-referenced these against algae and mud samples from Miss Cara Bassett's boots, a wheelchair at Miss Bassett's park, and the van's gas and brake pedals. These all matched.
And Mr. Niagara, let's get that report on the screen. And Your Honor, this again is already in evidence. So, Agent Branham, what exactly did this report show you?
Well, it indicated to us that all of those algae samples and those mud samples, so the mud from the Greater Tallahassee, from Miss Bassett's boots, from that swamp, and within that van, all at the same point of origin, and likely had been in contact with each other. So those boots had been to the swamp and had been in that van.
Ma'am, based off of this report, is it possible that that algae came from somewhere other than the Big Gum Swamp?
It's highly unlikely. We actually found 2 specific strains of algae. It's very uncommon to see these algae together. We wouldn't expect to find multiple points of origin for that specific combination.
Now let's go back to the defendant's words. Did the defendant say anything during this time when her husband disappeared?
No, sir, she did not. Miss Bassett did not report Mr. Clark's disappearance for a week.
Let's talk about the defendant's words after her husband went missing. Do you know if the defendant ever spoke about her husband after that point?
To my knowledge, no.
Did you ever speak?
Your Honor, speculation may be heard.
You may.
Your Honor, for Mr. Reese to ask the witness, the question is phrased, did she ever speak about her husband after August 18th? Your Honor, that's speculative. This witness wasn't with Miss Bassett every single hour of every single day. She certainly can't testify as to whether or not she talked about her husband to anyone.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Please.
Your Honor, this witness testified to her knowledge, no. The only question and answer that was being elicited here, the only testimony that was being elicited here, is that this witness never heard Miss Clark talk about her husband, even though she did interview him after that point. That's all that this is being used to prove, and that's something this witness does have personal knowledge of.
Response, Your Honor?
Briefly.
Your Honor, we're fine with counsel asking if he heard her talk about it or if Ms. Bassett talked about her husband to this witness. But to make that statement that she didn't talk about her husband after August 18th steps beyond her personal knowledge.
I tend to agree with defense counsel, although unfortunately because of this medium, we did get an answer before we were able to stop with the objection, and the answer I think is fine because she's talking about to the best of her knowledge. So I'll sustain the objection and ask counsel to rephrase, and I suspect that will satisfy the defense.
Move to strike the statement that was entered onto the record.
That's granted.
Yes, Your Honor.
Agent Branham, did you ever speak with the defendant after her husband went missing?
I did, yes. The FBI conducted a formal interview on September 5th of 2018.
Did anything the defendant said during that interview stick with you?
Yes. The defendant spoke at length about her passion for the elephants and the elephant park. She indicated that Mr. Clark had intended to run the park.
Objection, best evidence, Your Honor, may be heard.
You may.
This document, Exhibit 3, has been provided as one of the exhibits in today's case. It's a transcript of that interview. If counsel's going to be asking questions about that interview, we'd ask that they move that transcript into evidence so the jury can see it in its entirety.
May I respond?
Yes.
Your Honor, we're only asking this witness about specific portions of the interview that stood out to her, and she actually sat in the room while this interview took place. She's allowed to testify as to what she heard from that interview without us having to actually admit the entirety of the exhibit into evidence.
Mr. Marx, do you have a response?
Yes, Your Honor. Once again, they're asking the witness to testify about statements made in that interview. We have that interview available as a document. Since it is that original document, we'd ask under Rule 1002 that it be entered into evidence.
I'm not convinced that Rule 1002 requires that the document be offered at this point. Do you have any other objections, though, to the question that counsel asked the witness?
We don't have an objection to those specific statements, no.
Okay, the objection's overruled.
So, Agent Branham, when you spoke with the defendant, did anything she said during that interview stick with you?
Yeah. As I was saying, she spoke at length about that elephant park and indicated that Mr. Clark had intended to run the park as, I believe, a business rather than a charity, which conflicted with Ms. Bassett's own intentions with the park.
Objection, speculation may be heard.
You may.
We're fine with the witness testifying about the statements from Ms. Bassett, but there is speculation within that Don Clark intended to run that park as a business. Your Honor, the witness is stepping into the mindset of Don Clark, and that's speculation.
May I respond?
You may.
Your Honor, as this witness testified, this is solely based on what Ms. Bassett said. Ms. Bassett said in that interview that she was upset because Don had been running the business like a charity. And Your Honor, if I anticipate a hearsay objection is going to come, that's not hearsay because we're not using this for the truth of the matter asserted under Rule 801 to prove that Don was actually running it as a business and not as a charity. What we're using it to prove is motive of the defendant, that because she wanted that sanctuary to become her own, she had the motive to kill Mr. Clark, make him disappear because of that disappearance clause, which the court already heard about.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes.
Again, we agree with counsel that statement, we're not objecting to hearsay to that statement. We know that it's a statement by a party opponent. But once again, even though it's still speculation because Ms. Bassett is saying what Don Clark intended, that he intended to run it as a business, that's her speculating and stepping into Don Clark's mindset. If the counsel wants to ask the witness about the feelings that Ms. Bassett said she had, we're fine with that. But for her to step into the mindset of Don Clark, we believe that's speculation.
Mr. Marx, Mr. Reese said that this was based on what she learned in the interview, that these were the defendant's words. Do you disagree?
We agree that those are the defendant's words, Your Honor. We're not objecting to bringing in the defendant's words. It's the statements by the defendant that are speculating about Don Clark's mindset.
Overruled.
So Agent Branham, once again, could you just continue with that? What did the defendant say that stuck with you?
Again, the defendant indicated that she understood Mr. Clark had intended to run this park as a business, and that this conflicted with how she intended to run the park. She wanted this to be more of a sanctuary rather than a for-profit venture.
What happened to that park after Mr. Clark disappeared?
Well, given the powers of that power of attorney agreement, Ms. Bassett was able to seize the park and run it as a sanctuary, as she had wanted all along.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Thank you. Mr. Marks, do you have cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Agent. Can you see and hear me okay?
I can. Good afternoon.
Just let me know if any of those tech problems, if that changes. Agent, I want to start by talking about the evidence supporting your theory. You don't have any eyewitnesses that saw Miss Bassett kill her husband, right?
That's correct.
Don't have any eyewitnesses that saw Miss Bassett yielding one of those syringes on August 18th.
That's correct.
You don't have any evidence, you don't have any DNA of Miss Bassett's found at the Big Gum Swamp, correct?
We did not swab an entire swamp for DNA. No, we did not.
Agent, you didn't find any tread impressions that matched Miss Bassett's boots at the Big Gum Swamp, did you?
No, we visited that swamp approximately a week after the van was placed at the swamp.
I'm not asking about when you visited. I'm asking about what you found, and you didn't find any of those tread impressions, right?
No, we did not.
Didn't find any tread impressions that matched the wheelchair, the wheels on the wheelchair you recovered, did you?
We didn't. We relied only on that forensic evidence, that algae evidence.
So that's a yes?
That's a yes.
You'd also agree with me that you believe Miss Bassett drove the car to the Caribellion Airport, right?
Yes, that's correct. Again, that's what the forensic evidence indicated.
Ma'am, we'll talk about the forensic evidence in a moment, but that's what you believe, right?
Yes.
You searched that airport, right?
That's correct, yes.
Searched Don and Kara's private hangar, right?
Yes, that's correct. Mr. Clark's airplane was in his hangar.
Didn't find Miss Bassett's fingerprints in that hangar, did you?
To my recollection, no, we did not.
Didn't find any of Miss Bassett's DNA in that airplane hangar?
To my recollection, no. I can't recall if we were specifically looking for that DNA.
So, ma'am, to your knowledge, you didn't find it, right?
No, no.
So I want to talk about what you did find. You tested the algae on Miss Bassett's boots, didn't you?
Yes, that's correct.
You reviewed the forensic report of that test, didn't you?
Correct.
Mr. Ragnoni, could we get that document, Exhibit 5, on the screen? Your Honor, it's one of those pre-admitted for pretrial order 7.
Thank you.
You'd agree with me that there are some things forensics can't tell us, right?
I would say so, yes, that's fair.
Forensics can't tell us how that algae got on Miss Bassett's boots.
No, they can't.
Forensics can't tell us when that algae got on Miss Bassett's boots.
Correct.
Can't tell us if it was on August 18th.
That's correct.
Can't tell us if it was a month earlier, right?
That's correct. That's why we really look at the totality of the evidence, especially that GPS data.
So that's a yes. It can't tell you if it was on August 18th or a month earlier, right?
Yes, correct.
In fact, your analyst actually told you that that algae can remain on surfaces for multiple months. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Your Honor, this is hearsay.
Response?
Yes.
The analyst's, that statement that it can remain on for multiple months is included in document Exhibit 5. It's in evidence.
Your Honor, may I respond?
You may.
Your Honor, this is now the hearsay statement that is being used. It is being used because it's in this document, but also it's being used to connect this witness to it. Even though it's in this document, because this witness didn't have any personal knowledge of it, and he's asking this witness about what that forensic analyst specifically told Agent Branna, it's still hearsay.
Response, Your Honor?
No. Did the witness author this document?
No, Your Honor. The witness reviewed the document.
Okay, yes, I'd like a response.
Your Honor, in this document that the witness had admitted to reviewing, it says that algae can remain on surfaces for multiple months. We're just cross-examining to the scope of that algae analysis that was talked about on direct examination. Further, Your Honor, the statement itself is already in evidence, so it's not hearsay.
Mr. Reese?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Marx just said that he's talking about this document in specific. However, he's not asking about when this witness reviewed this document. He's asking about what the forensic analyst specifically told this witness, which is not already in evidence, and it's inadmissible hearsay.
I think that's probably true. Mr. Marx, do you have a final response?
Yes, Your Honor. In that document, it says that the algae remained on there for multiple months. The question was, you learn from your analyst that the algae can remain on there for multiple months. The statement is contained within that document that she reviewed. We're only asking her about that document, which she admits to having knowledge about.
Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Agent, in that document from your forensic analyst, it says that algae can remain on shoes for multiple months, right?
Yes.
You've been to Carabassett's Elephant Park, haven't you?
Yes,
Would you recognize photos of that park?
I would.
Mr. Ragnoni, could we get exhibits 23 through 25 on the screen? They're pre-admitted once again, Your Honor. Agent, you know that there's mud at that park, don't you?
There is, yes.
You know that the samples collected from Miss Bassett's shoes, the wheelchair, and the car, they looked like dried mud, isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct.
But your team, in their entire investigation, didn't take any samples of mud from the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, isn't that right?
That is correct. The specific algae combination that we found at the Big Gum Swamp, it was highly unlikely we would find this combination elsewhere.
Well, I'm not asking about what you found, I'm asking about what you tested. And you didn't test any of that mud, right?
Correct.
In fact, you didn't test any natural substances from the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, isn't that right?
That's correct.
Agent, we've talked a lot about the physical evidence. Want to shift gears and talk about this potential motive. Don't have any eyewitness reports that told you that Kara Bassett and Don got in an argument on August 18th, right?
To my knowledge, no.
Don't have any eyewitnesses that told you that Kara and Don had an argument in the week leading up to his disappearance.
That's correct.
Don't have any eyewitnesses that Kara and Don were arguing in the entire month of August, right?
I believe that's correct, yes.
So I want to compare that story to the story with Don's other spouse. You know who Lisa Clark is, don't you?
Yes, I'm familiar with Miss Clark.
You know that Lisa's Don's ex-wife, right?
Correct.
You spoke to Don Clark's attorney, didn't you?
I did, Miss Mandy Tumnelli.
She sent you a letter, right?
Yes.
In that letter, she told you that Lisa would constantly harass Don. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
In that letter, she told you that Lisa was suing Don. Isn't that right?
That's correct. There was some sort of alimony dispute.
So you tried to call Lisa, didn't you?
Yes, that's correct.
You told her you wanted to ask her some questions about her husband, right?
That's correct, yes.
When you mentioned her ex-husband, she replied that expletive deserved to die. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct.
She refused to cooperate with your investigation. Isn't that right?
Yes, she didn't wish to become involved with the investigation.
Let's compare her words to the words of the defendant. Defendant cooperated fully with your investigation. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Answered every question you asked.
Yes.
You interviewed her 12 times. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Fully cooperated.
Yes.
You know as well that Miss Bassett's cell phone records, they actually place her at home at the Elephant Park. Isn't that right?
We don't actually have Miss Bassett's cell phone records to describe her movements on the night of August 18th, beyond that she was at the park at some point that night.
Ma'am, it showed in those cell phone records, she was at that park for 168 hours, right?
The cell phone records don't actually place Miss Bassett herself at the park for the entirety of the time covered between when Miss Bassett was at the park using that phone and days later when she used that phone.
Ma'am, they placed her cell phone there, right?
Yes, they placed her cell phone there at some point.
And you don't know where Lisa Clark was on that night, do you?
No, we do not.
And ma'am, I'm looking for a number of all the people you tried to interview. How many of them refused to cooperate?
To my recollection, one.
That's Lisa Clark, right?
Yes.
No further questions.
Thank you. Is there a redirect examination?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Agent Branham, did you ever find any physical evidence to suggest Lisa Clark committed this crime?
No, sir. the only physical evidence linked Miss Bassett to the crime.
Thank you, Agent Branham. Thank you, Your Honor. Nothing further.
Thank you. Mr. Marks, do you have any additional cross-examination?
Could I inquire as to the time I may have left on cross-examination?
Of course.
I believe I do have a little bit of time, unless government second chair disagrees. May we proceed?
Yes, if you have time.
My second chair confirmed that we do have some time.
Okay,
Okay.
proceed.
Great. Agent, you didn't search Lisa Clark's house, correct?
I know we were unable to conduct a search of Miss Clark's home.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Thank you. Anything further from the government?
No, Your Honor. At this time, the government rests.
Okay, thank you very much. Is the defense prepared to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Joe Young to the stand.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Miss Young. Can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Could you go ahead and introduce yourself to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury?
Of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Young, and I make documentaries. I think they really tell people's truths and their stories.
How did you get involved in telling other people's stories, ma'am?
When I was little, I used to listen to fairy tales and watch movies, and I really just wanted to get to the truth of things, tell people's honest truth and who they were.
And in telling those stories, did you ever learn about the story of someone named Kara Bassett?
Yes, I know Kara.
I want to start at the beginning of that story. Well, when did you first meet Kara?
I met Kara in 2015. That's when she contacted me to work on her documentary.
What was that documentary called, ma'am?
It was called Elephant Queen.
During your time working at that documentary, did you see that elephant park?
Yes, I did. I was at the park 5 days a week, 10 hours a day for 3 years.
Would you recognize some photographs of that park, ma'am?
Absolutely.
Mr. Ragnoni, could we get exhibits 23 through 25 on the screen? Again, Your Honor, they've been pre-admitted. Ma'am, what was that park like?
That's the elephant park. There was dust and dirt everywhere, but the elephants were really sweet, and I often saw guests there and Kara and Dawn interacting with them.
How many days a week were you at that park, ma'am?
5 days a week.
And by the end of your time working on that project, about how many hours of footage would you say you had?
I had about 2,000 hours of footage.
And during your time working there, did you get to know someone named Dawn Clark pretty well?
Yes, I was friends with Dawn.
What about Kara? Did you get to know her well?
Yes.
So I want to talk about Dawn and Kara's relationship. Did you see them being affectionate with one another?
Yes, I did.
And during your time there, ma'am, did you ever see any infidelity or signs of infidelity?
No, I didn't.
Did you ever see Kara try to hit Dawn?
No.
Did you witness any disagreements between the two of them?
Yes, of course I did. They argued, but I never saw them physically hit each other.
Ma'am, I want to shift gears. I want to talk to you about a particular day, August 18th, 2017. Do you remember what you were doing on that day?
Yes, I got to the park at 8 and I was filming just like normal.
What were you filming for the majority of that day?
I was filming Kara and Kara's interactions with the elephants that day.
Was there anything out of the ordinary in Kara's behavior?
No, not that I remember. She was acting pretty normal.
Did you see Dawn Clark on that day, ma'am?
Yes, I did.
Was there anything out of the ordinary in Dawn Clark's behavior from what you could observe?
No, Dawn was also acting pretty normal that day.
Ma'am, did you see Dawn Clark ever again after August 18th, 2017?
No, I didn't. That was the last day that I saw him.
Let's talk about what happened after Dawn disappeared. Were you made aware of the FBI investigation into his disappearance?
Yes, I was. I tried to film as much as possible.
Did the FBI ever ask you any questions, ma'am?
Barely. They asked me 2 or 3 at most.
You told us earlier that you had about 2,000 hours of footage Did the FBI ask to see any of your footage?
No, they didn't. I'm still waiting for my phone to ring.
Ma'am, we've talked about the story between Dawn and Kara. Want to talk about the story with Dawn's other spouse? Do you know who Lisa Clark is?
Yes, I do. She was a piece of work.
Did you read Dawn Clark's obituary, ma'am?
Yes, I did.
In that obituary, did you learn about a lawsuit between Dawn and Lisa?
Yes, I did.
Did you learn how much Lisa was suing Dawn for?
Yes, according to this obituary, Lisa was suing Dawn for $2 million.
Had you ever seen Lisa at that elephant park?
Yes, I had. And every time she came, she would cause problems.
Let's talk about that. What was she doing when she was at the park?
Most of the time, she was just yelling at Dawn.
Do you remember a specific statement that she yelled at Dawn?
Yes, one time they were in an argument and Lisa said, "I'm gonna wipe you off the face of the earth."
Ma'am, on August 18th, ma'am, I want to talk about an interview you did. During that interview, were you shown a document, Dawn Clark's cell phone records? Were you shown that?
Yes, I was.
I want to talk about a certain text from Lisa Clark. Mr. Ragnoni, could we get that document on the screen? It's pre-admitted, Your Honor. Mr. Ragnoni, could you zoom in on the text from August 18th by Lisa Clark? Could you read that text, ma'am?
Of course. "I'm tired of the lawyers. Can we please resolve this on our own, like adults?"
Ma'am, did you witness Dawn and Kara arguing on that same day that text was sent, August 18th?
No, they weren't fighting that day.
Thank you, ma'am. Your Honor, we have nothing further at the time.
Thank you. Does the government have a cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, Miss Young.
Good afternoon.
Ma'am, I want to start by talking about your relationship with the defendant. You first met the defendant back in 2015, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
She wanted you to make a documentary about her and that elephant park.
Yes, that's correct.
And ma'am, at that very first meeting in 2015, the defendant told you that one day it would be the world's largest elephant sanctuary, didn't she?
Yeah, that's what she said.
She told you that she wanted to make people finally care about protecting elephants.
Yes, that's what she said in that first interview.
And ma'am, at that first interview, the defendant titled that documentary, didn't she?
I believe that she and Dawn came up with it together. It was called Elephant Queen.
Right, ma'am. She told you at that first interview that she wanted it to be called Elephant Queen.
Yes, that's correct.
And Miss Young, you went on a TV interview before coming to court today, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
You never said in that interview that Miss Bassett and her husband came up with that title together, did you?
I didn't say it there, but it was my understanding that's what had happened.
Right, and when you asked the defendant why she wanted that title to be Elephant Queen, she told you that one day that's how people would think of her, right?
Yes, that's the point of a documentary.
You'd agree with me, the defendant cared a lot about those elephants.
Yes, she did.
You know from your conversations with the defendant, she saw that elephant park as a cause.
Yes, she did. She really cared about it.
But you also know that Mr. Clark saw that park as a business.
Objection,
Yes.
lack of foundation as to how the witness knows that.
Response.
Your Honor, we don't need to lay this foundation on cross-examination. On direct, the witness testified that she worked with Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark for 3 years, that she had conversations when she was filming a documentary about that park, and that she knew from her conversations with Miss Bassett that Miss Bassett saw that park as a cause. If she's testifying to what Miss Bassett told her here, then she can certainly testify as to what Miss Bassett told her about how Mr. Clark felt about that elephant park.
So is your argument that you don't need to lay the foundation, or that you have laid the foundation?
And not that we've laid the foundation, because it was already laid by the government on direct examination.
By the defense on direct examination?
Yes, Your Honor, my apologies.
Mr. Mark?
We would disagree that that foundation has been laid. We've shown that she knew Mr. Clark. But this question takes it a step further, asking about what Mr. Clark believed. We'd ask that counsel lay the specific foundation, whether it came from a statement, so that the court knows where that's coming from, whether it's coming from Dawn or from Kara, and just to lay that appropriate foundation.
I think that would be appropriate. Objection sustained.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Young, you know from your conversations with the defendant and being at that park for 3 years that Mr. Clark saw those elephants in that park as a business.
That's what Kara told me that Dawn believed, yes.
They would fight about that park, wouldn't they?
Yes, that was the only thing they really fought about was the elephants.
The defendant wanted to change that park to a sanctuary, but her husband wouldn't let her.
Objection once again, lack of foundation. We'd ask that those specific statements be entered onto the record in order so that we know whether it's a statement from Ms. Bassett or from her husband. That foundation hasn't been entered.
Your Honor, may I be heard? I asked this witness if she knew that that Ms. Bassett wanted to turn that park into a sanctuary, but her husband wouldn't let her. If she knows, she can simply testify to that, and if she doesn't know, she can say she doesn't know. We don't need to lay specific foundation as to how she knows at this point, because we know that she had conversations with Ms. Bassett and that she worked at that park for 3 years.
Your Honor, our objection wasn't to lack of personal knowledge, it was to lack of foundation.
Right, I understand. I agree with you that we heard on direct examination that this witness had a lot of interactions with the defendant and her husband, but I don't think that that means that you necessarily aren't required to lay appropriate foundation for certain questions on cross-examination. And so I'm going to sustain the objection again.
Yes, Your Honor. So, Ms. Young, you knew from your conversations with the defendant and her husband that she wanted to change that park to a sanctuary, but her husband wouldn't let her.
Yes.
Once again, Your Honor, we'd re-raise that lack of foundation objection.
No, I think the question was, you know, from conversations with the defendant. Was that not what you asked, Mr. Reese?
That was what I asked, Your Honor.
Okay, I think that's appropriate then, overruled.
So, Ms. Young, just to clarify, that was a yes. You knew from conversations with the defendant and her husband that she wanted to change it to a sanctuary, but her husband wouldn't let her.
Yes, to my understanding, Dawn owned the park, so he had the final say.
Let's go to the summer of 2017. Around August of that summer, the defendant and her husband were fighting about that elephant park, weren't they?
Yes, I believe so.
The defendant got so angry during that argument, she threw a vase at her husband's head.
I believe that happened in June of 2017, not August.
And Ms. Young, you'd agree with me that it happened around August of 2017, either in July or August. That's what you said in that interview, wasn't it?
Objection, Your Honor, improper character evidence.
Response?
Your Honor, I already asked this witness about whether or not that vase was thrown at Mr. Clark's head, so that's already in evidence. Furthermore, Your Honor, on Mr. Mark's direct examination, he asked this witness if she ever saw Mr. Clark get hit by Ms. Bassett. This testimony is directly being used to rebut that and to show that there were violent instances. And furthermore, we're using it to prove motive under 404B2 to show the extent of the defendant's motive and just how far she'd be willing to go to protect those elephants.
Mr. Marx?
Your Honor, we don't believe that this is being used under 404B to show a motive. Your Honor, we're fine with statements coming in that they had disagreed about elephants, that could go to her potential motive to kill him because she loved animals. But for this specific instance of conduct of Ms. Bassett throwing a vase towards Dawn, it's being used to show propensity, that she'd acted aggressively in the past and that she was going to act aggressively on the day in question.
I'll take counsel at his word that they're using this under 404B for motive, and so I'll overrule the objection. But to the extent that later, either in this examination or in the closing argument or some other part of the trial, you believe that the government is doing more than that, you should let the court know.
Yes, Your Honor. We'd ask for a limiting instruction in that effect to the jury.
That's granted.
Thank you.
So, Miss Young, during that fight around August, you saw the defendant throw a vase at her husband's head.
Yes, she did.
And ma'am, the defendant and her husband, they've been fighting like that for years.
I'm not sure what you mean. This was the only physical fight I'd ever seen between them.
Well, they've been arguing about that elephant park for years.
Yes, verbal arguments.
And now let's talk about the day that you spent at the elephant park on August 18th of 2017. That day, you didn't see Lisa Clark at the elephant park, did you?
No, I didn't.
You didn't see Lisa Clark at the elephant park in the week leading up to her?
Not that I remember, no.
So let's talk about the defendant's words at this point. And ma'am, you interviewed the defendant before and after her husband went missing, didn't you?
Yes, I did. It's my job.
Right, and you'd agree with me that exhibits 36 and 37, those are fair and accurate copies of a video interview you did with the defendant on June 15th of 2017.
Yes, that's correct.
Your Honor, at this time, the government would move pre-marked exhibits 36 and 37 into evidence.
Without objection.
Okay, very good. 36 and 37 are admitted.
Mr. Nigro, could we please play exhibit 36 for the court?
Oh, I'm scheming. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
Miss Young, that was the defendant talking about that elephant park, wasn't it?
To my knowledge, yes.
To your knowledge, you know that the defendant wanted to take control of that elephant park. Didn't you know that?
It was my understanding she just wanted some say in how it was run, but yes.
Mr. Nigro, could we please play exhibit 37 for the court?
Nothing is more important to me than these animals. Nothing.
Miss Young, both of those videos, they were taken just 2 months before Mr. Clark went missing.
Yes, that's correct, June.
Let's talk about after he went missing. You interviewed the defendant again on December 24th of 2017.
Yes, I did.
Exhibit 44 is that interview?
Yes.
Your Honor, we move 44 into evidence.
Any objection?
Without objection, Your Honor.
Okay, exhibit 44 is admitted.
Mr. Nigro, let's please play that for the court.
It's Christmas Eve. Don's not here, and I miss him very much. I feel his absence every single day. And it's difficult to find the strength to go on.
Miss Young, that video was taken just 4 months after the defendant's husband disappeared.
Correct, December of 2017.
Thank you, Miss Young. Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Is there a redirect examination?
Yes, briefly, Your Honor.
Please proceed.
Miss Young, opposing counsel asked you about whether you saw Lisa Clark at the park on August 18th. Were you there after 6 p.m. that night?
No, I wasn't. I usually left every day at 6.
Thank you, ma'am. No further questions, Your Honor.
Okay, anything else from the government?
There's nothing else from the government, Your Honor.
Anything further from the defense?
No, Your Honor. At this time, the defense rests their case.
Okay, very good. We will now hear closing arguments from each party. Everyone should please switch back to speaker view. Also, since both witnesses have completed their testimony, you can complete the witness portion of your ballot. Mr. Reese, you may proceed whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Follow the defendant's words. Members of the jury, on August 18th of 2017, Don Clark was murdered. He didn't disappear into thin air. He didn't up and leave to go to Costa Rica. He was taken to a swamp, was injected with elephant tranquilizer, and his body was dumped. Oh, my apologies, Your Honor. My second chair isn't in the Zoom call.
Okay. We'll wait for...
Is there a way that we could restart that?
That's fine with me. Does the bailiff have any issue with that?
That sounds appropriate to me, Your Honor.
I'm
Okay.
so sorry about that.
No, that's okay. It's not you. It's the format. Is the second chair back yet?
No, we're still waiting for him to get in.
Okay, I think we have some time, so let's give him a minute to return.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. Okay, I think the second chair is back now, so I think we're ready.
Okay, you may proceed when you are ready.
Yes, Your Honor, my apologies again. Follow the defendant's words. Members of the jury, on August 18th of 2017, Don Clark was murdered. He didn't disappear into thin air. He didn't up and leave to go to Costa Rica. He was injected with an elephant tranquilizer, taken to a swamp, and had his body dumped somewhere no one would find him. And the person who did that was the defendant. That's why we've charged her with murder, which means that today, as the government, it was our burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant deliberately and intentionally caused the death of her husband. That is exactly what we proved, and we proved it by following the defendant's words. From before, to during, to after she killed her husband. So let's start with before. Members of the jury, today you heard before the defendant killed her husband, she was angry with him. They had been fighting for years over turning that elephant park into a sanctuary. The defense's own witness, Joe Young, told you back in 2015, the defendant had already made up her mind. She wanted that park to become the nation's largest elephant sanctuary. She wanted Mr. Clark to make people finally care about protecting elephants. She wanted to be the elephant queen. But her husband wouldn't budge. He told her it was a business, not a charity. And members of the jury, let's just get this straight. He didn't tell that to Lisa Clark. Lisa Clark didn't have any stake in getting that elephant park. But what you did see were those videos of the defendant from just 2 months before her husband went missing. She told you herself she was steaming. Nothing was more important to her than those elephants. Lisa Clark didn't feel that way. We have the right spouse. We're telling the right story. And we know that at that time when the defendant took those videos, she already had her plan to take control of that park. Your Honor, this is already in evidence pursuant to Stipulation 7. At the time that Miss Clark sat down to make this agreement, she already had her plan. She saw her moment and she used her words to take it. She asked Mr. Clark's attorney to include a disappearance clause, a new section to that agreement that would give Miss Bassett control of that park if her husband mysteriously disappeared. Lisa Clark didn't have a disappearance clause. We have the right spouse. We're telling the right story. Because Mr. Clark did disappear. He disappeared because the defendant murdered him. Members of the jury, today, you saw this elephant log. Remember that on the weeks before Mr. Clark went missing, there were 24 syringes of that elephant tranquilizer at the park. Agent Branham told you when she went to investigate, she only found 23. Members of the jury, that's not just some coincidence. That's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And Lisa Clark didn't have access to that log. She didn't have access to the tranquilizer. That's what Agent Branham told you. We have the right spouse. We're telling the right story. And then we see those GPS records. We see that that van at the elephant park left late at night and got there early in the morning. And then it stayed there. It stayed at that swamp for almost an hour. More than enough time for the defendant to get Mr. Clark out of that van and into that swamp. And we know that it was the defendant driving that van because you saw that algae test. Remember that the very specific kind of algae found on the defendant's boots and on those pedals was also found at the Big Gum Swamp. Lisa Clark didn't have access to that van. Lisa Clark didn't have algae on any of her items. Members of the jury, we have the right spouse. We're telling the right story. And when we go back to the defendant's words, we see that in that time her husband disappeared, she didn't say anything. She didn't call, didn't text, didn't tell the police until an entire week after her husband went missing. So we return to her words after she killed her husband. On my cross-examination of Mr. Young, you saw that video of the defendant. Ask yourselves, did that really seem like someone who was upset that they have no idea where their husband is? Or did it seem like someone who had gotten exactly what they wanted? And the defendant did get exactly what she wanted. You heard today, just 2 months after Mr. Clark went missing, she turned that elephant park into a sanctuary, just like she'd always wanted to. Members of the jury, when you follow the defendant's words, they lead you straight to her motive, straight to her opportunity, and straight to proof beyond a reasonable doubt that she murdered her husband. We have the right spouse. We're telling the right story. Find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Counsel for the defendant, you may proceed when you are ready.
Thank you. Judge Harper, Mr. Reese, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, follow the defendant's words. We've heard that statement a lot today. It's a catchy line. It's a nice way of directing your attention. But today you have to look a step deeper. You can't lock onto a target and only follow the defendant's words. No. You have a responsibility to follow all the suspect's words. So what did Mr. Reese have us follow? Well, we know and we admit that Tara Bassett and Don Clark, yes, they had disagreements. But a disagreement is not a death threat. So you have to ask yourself, when we follow Lisa Clark's words, do we see a death threat? And the answer is yes. I will wipe you off the face of the earth. Lisa Clark told us with her words exactly what she was going to do. Now, Mr. Reese said in his closing argument that Lisa didn't have any stake in that park, and we agree. We're not saying that Lisa Clark killed Don for that park. She killed him because she wasn't getting her money. She was fed up. She was angry. Her husband had left him to be with a much younger wife. She was upset. And then Mr. Reese told you that Lisa Clark didn't have access to that tranquilizer, and we agree. We don't believe that Lisa Clark killed him with the tranquilizer. We don't have to prove what Lisa Clark killed him with. It was the government's job to prove that she couldn't have killed him. Members of the jury, we don't know whether there's a gun on Miss Clark's nightstand that was used to kill Don Clark. We don't know if she's got a knife with Don Clark's blood in her closet. And we don't know that because the government never investigated Lisa Clark. And there's one more thing I want to address that Mr. Reese said. He said Lisa Clark didn't have algae on her clothing. We certainly don't know that fact. We don't know it because the government, the FBI, didn't test Lisa Clark's clothes. They've got the wrong spouse, and they're telling the wrong story. Today, it was the government's job to prove their story, every element of that story beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, we'll talk about that standard in a few moments, how it's the highest standard in the American legal system. But for the moment, ladies and gentlemen, all you need to know is that they haven't met it. Let's talk about that FBI investigation. Agent Branham told you that other than the algae, there's no evidence connecting Miss Bassett to the scene of the crime. No fingerprints, no DNA, no blood evidence, no tread impressions, no eyewitnesses, no cell data, no video footage, nothing. So let's talk about that algae. We agree that the same species of algae that was at the Big Gum Swamp was also on Miss Bassett's boots. But it's not that simple. In fact, we learned today that it can't be that simple. Now, maybe it could be that simple. If Miss Bassett worked at a restaurant or a hospital or an office or a school, but she doesn't. Maybe it would be convincing evidence. If the FBI had tested any of the mud, the dirt, the watering holes, the puddles, or anywhere else on that 3,200-acre elephant park where algae can be, but we learned that they didn't. Instead, they assumed, asked you to assume, that there was no other way that that algae could have gotten on Miss Bassett's boots, and because of that, there are unanswered questions left by the government in this case. They've got the wrong spouse. And the reason their case has so many unanswered questions is because they're telling the wrong story. The FBI just wants to tell you, the FBI and the government wants to tell you that you can just ignore Lisa Clark, that she doesn't matter. Members of the jury, yes, she does. Let's compare the words that the government heard from Lisa Clark and Kara Bassett. The government goes to Kara Bassett, says, "Ma'am, we'd like to ask you a few questions." What does Miss Bassett say? She says, "That's fine. I'll help you out. I just want to find my husband." She sits down with them 12 times and uses her words to answer their questions. Then the FBI goes to Lisa Clark. What does she say? She doesn't say, "That's fine. I'd love to help." She doesn't say, "No thanks. I don't really want to talk at this time." She says, "That expletive deserved to die." What does the FBI do? Do they follow Lisa Clark's words? No, they do nothing. Don't subpoena her phone records. Don't search her house. Don't test her clothes for algae. Don't investigate the person who was suing Don for $2 million and had threatened to kill him in the past. And because of that, we don't have an alibi. We don't know where Lisa Clark was on August 18th. They've got the wrong spouse. And they're telling the wrong story. In fact, they can't even get that story straight, ladies and gentlemen. You see, on the one hand, the government wants to tell you that Lisa Clark, or Kara Bassett rather, is such an ingenious criminal mastermind that she could hide Don's body so well that an entire team of FBI agents and police officers can't find a scrap of evidence that it's actually at that swamp. But she couldn't sign her initials on that tranquilizer log or burn her shoes. Members of the jury, Miss Bassett had an entire week to ditch the van, cover up the carfentanil, burn her shoes, burn her clothes, delete that log. Why didn't she do it? Maybe she didn't do it because she didn't have anything to cover up. But that's not the only thing that doesn't make sense. The government tells you to follow the defendant's words, to look at that power of attorney document, but they don't want you to follow the words of Don Clark's own attorney when he says that Lisa constantly harassed Don. They just want you to tell you to ignore them. that it doesn't matter, but members of the jury, yes, it does. It's reasonable doubt. Now, I promised I'd talk about that standard. The way it works is that whenever we reach a point in the government story where a presumption need be made, the only one you can make is innocence. Let me give you an example. When the government says that Miss Bassett accessed that car fentanyl, but we know other park employees had access, I'm sure there's a lot of ways you could patch that up. Presumptions we can make. The one the law requires you to make is innocence. But when the FBI says that that algae matches to the swamp, but we don't know what they would have found had they tested her own park, presumption, innocence, ladies and gentlemen, there are so many holes, so many presumptions they're asking you to make. And to each one, you must conclude innocence. That's reasonable doubt. Find or not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Mr. Reese?
Yes, Your Honor. Before I proceed with my rebuttal, permission to display a demonstrative on the screen for the court.
You may.
Thank you. May I proceed?
Yes.
Members of the jury, Miss Clark didn't have any physical evidence pointing to her as the suspect. She didn't have anything to gain from that disappearance clause if her ex-husband was killed, and she didn't have access to the murder weapon or that van that was driven to the swamp. We have the right spouse, we're telling the right story, find her guilty.
Thank you very much, counsel. Judges should now please complete their ballots and click submit.